Okay, sweet. I think I've got it streaming now. So,
Sweet.
welcome everybody. Welcome to our space here. Dave pinged me the other day. Thought it might be a good idea if we do a space related to some of the advanced science concepts that we've been talking about. And of course, I thought, damn, that's a really good idea. And I know a lot of people have been wanting to do spaces as well um, on Twitter here or X, whatever we're calling it now. So I think that the way this will go down, just in the interest of time, is we'll start off with some introductions. Um, then I'll kind of talk with Dave a little bit about some of the science stuff, and then we'll start to bring people up who want to ask questions and dig into it. But the main idea here is that we wanted to understand the best of our abilities these advanced science concepts like how we unify quantum and macro, what the implications can mean in terms of breaking down the space time vacuum. And then we can go into some of the stuff like, well, what does this mean with respect to the UFO community, UAPs that we see flying around, et cetera. How does that sound to you, Dave?
That sounds great. Yeah, because there's a few things that I wanted to break down to attempt to help clarify some basic concepts for everybody, and I really like that. So we can discuss and then go to uh, just chatting with everybody here.
Awesome, man. So I think I'm just going to start with I'll introduce myself, and then you can introduce yourself however you want. And then we can just start getting into some of the discussion. I think this is going to be more of just kind of free flow discussion. So, yeah, let us just talk for a little bit, and then if when we open it up to questions, we can bring people up and people can kind of chat and ask whatever they want. So, my name is Ashton Forbes. I am the organizer of MH370X. I call myself an investigator because I've been looking into the MH370 videos, and the thing that I would say about what's got me interested is that I feel like I'm in a scenario where, as you guys can probably relate, that we have like the answer sheet to a test and we're staring at the answers. But what we need to figure out is how do we show our work? How do we prove that this is actually how we get there? When I was in physics class, science class, math class, you couldn't just have the answer. You had to be able to show your work as well. So I almost feel like we're working backwards and we're looking at the end product and going, okay, we know how these things can fly now. We know how the science can operate. Now let's figure out how it works. So my goal here, my goal as always, has been to just try to understand the science, understand the technology, and understand its implications on humanity. And I hope that we can drive that conversation forward. Go ahead, Dave.
All right, thank you. So, first off, Ashton, thank you so much for putting this together, brother. I really appreciate it. And some of you here may know me already. I am the host of the Generation Z podcast, and then in the last couple of years, also was gracious enough to be, through an interesting set of events, pulled into the contracting slash consulting world to try to bring a fair amount of this technology out in conjunction with others, because there are quite a few others that do believe this should come out. And I think that by breaking down a couple of basic concepts, this may help, I guess, not necessarily enlighten, but perhaps help people concisely discern between the different phenomena they're seeing with craft and whatnot, because there's a few different things to break down that I'm going to try to do as best as I can, as basic as possible. And just wanted to know, Ashton, if there's anything else you wanted to jump in with, or if I can go ahead with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just listen to what you have first and see if it already covers. I wrote some notes of stuff that I wanted to talk to you about, but I'd rather have you just kind of say what you want to say, and then I may jump in here or there if I have stuff I want to kind of expand upon.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so a couple things with regards to, I already see some people tag me in a couple tweets under the thread. They're asking me some questions, and I will do my best to answer all of them. So there's a few different things we have to realize, and one of them is that we need to realize that there are a few different, we could say, apparatuses or avenues that make these craft operate. Now, I'm not saying that I claim to know every single way that these craft operate. There's certainly more than one way to skin this cat. I would dare to say there's probably anywhere from 5 to 8 ways to tap this type of energy and to tap this type of phenomena that we're seeing. With that said, though, at the end of the day, what we have to realize is that when we look at something, for example, like what has been called inertial mass reduction, that is basically causing an object to lose its internal weight, essentially. Now, something like that in a particular instance would be more so when one is seeing a craft sort of slowly lift off the ground in a certain regard, and that is indicative of a slow but gradual resonance occurring around the perimeter and arguably inside the craft, that is allowing the craft to begin to lift up. Now, when it comes to the concept of when a craft is immediately seen zooming off to the point where it almost doesn't even look real, that is a separate concept with regards to what we can call graviton emission. So that would be a pulsed powered situation, whereas the inertial mass reduction would be more of a spin resonance sort of uh, method or setup, whereas the pulsation that make the craft immediately zoom off again to the point where it doesn't even look real at all, is something that would be a pulsed graviton emission situation. Now, the final thing is the third concept, which is the polarization of the vacuum, essentially, which means that you are polarizing the sort of like if you were to be put yourself in a boat in water, and you were to make the boat move quicker the same way that one does when a surfer surfs on water, right? This speaks to, of course, the Alcubierre warp drive and all of that. Now, the idea with that is we use electricity and magnetism to create a situation where there are, for lack of a better term, fractal toroids that encompass the entire craft, not necessarily observable to the human eye, but certainly allow the craft to move at extreme speeds, as well as put a warp bubble around it so then it can go into water, it can go into different environments and not have anything affect it. Because this electromagnetic polarization, the same way that one surfs on water, is constantly creating a shift where one doesn't even need to, where there's sort of a separation in the vacuum around the craft. But without getting too much into that, I just wanted to start off by laying out a few of the different concepts that seem to be I'm not saying for anyone here, but in general seem to be misunderstood by many, which I can understand because it's very difficult to grasp this type of science when there's not really too much of a foundation, and especially when, in my humble opinion, many different scientists that advocate for the transparency of this type of physics and engineering are possibly saying the same thing just in their own ways or terms. And so that's when I would very much say that anywhere from 40 to 60% of understanding this is simply just, I call, quote unquote, translating from one form of interpretation to another.
Yeah,
And
quick.
so I think that,
If I
yeah,
could just jump in right there, Dave. So just to reiterate, I mean, what you're saying is that there's two different elements at play, two different things at play, especially if we were talking about, let's say, hypothetically, three orbs that are circling around a plane. Um,
right.
one is that they are freely floating and ignoring gravity inside of essentially a bubble, the non-radiating barrier that I think we see in some videos out there that allow it to completely suspend themselves from gravity because now you've got your mass reduced to zero and now you're not going to be affected by the local gravity of space-time around the Earth. Can you elaborate just a little bit more on that part? Is that the one that's the pulse graviton emission? Just so I can kind of separate these concepts in my mind in terms of what would be causing them and how they would differentiate from a scientific perspective?
Sure, no problem. You pretty much laid it out fairly well with what you just said there. But with that said, to give a very basic example for everyone here, and I'll connect it back to the situation with the plane. So, for example, it's been thought classically that if you had a kid on a swing and you push the kid on the swing, eventually, the swing, like a pendulum, will oscillate back and forth depending on how hard or soft you push the kid, and therefore the swing. The child will eventually get off the swing, and once they leave the swing, classically, it's been thought that once the swing comes to rest, that's it, the swing is staying still. But in quantum mechanics, it's a very well known, understood concept that at the Planck or quantum level, whatever we want to refer to it as, the swing never stops oscillating. Just because we cannot see it oscillating after we think it looks like it's still doesn't mean that it's actually still. And so the question then becomes, is it possible to lock in using perhaps lasers, to lock in to or with that oscillation? Now, for those that may be saying, well, is this even possible? Please know that you don't have to take my word for it. You can look, for example, at what the Germans called the Zitterbuegung effect, which if I can translate loosely, if anyone wants to search it up, you're more than welcome to it. Roughly translates to, I believe, the some type of jitterbug or some type of oscillation, which speaks to what is called the Heisenberg certainty principle, where if one knows the position of a particle, you cannot know its velocity. And if you can measure its velocity, you can therefore not know its position. So you can know one, but you cannot know both at the same time. And so this speaks to the notion that matter at the Planck level all around us is constantly oscillating. moving back and forth like a little jitterbug, even though we cannot see it. Now, in the case of the plane, if the plane had a particular resonant frequency, what I mean by that is if the metal around that comprised the plane itself had a particular resonant frequency, it could be possible to, in fact, in a certain situation, use lasers, for example, to lock in with that resonant frequency and then create its own form of rotation on its own axis that will then allow for the plane to lose its internal weight. It would then therefore allow for the orbs to polarize the local vacuum around the plane, and then finally allow for a potential graviton pulsation, which would highly be indicative of the final alleged disappearance that we see on the footage itself.
That's interesting. Now, what about the orbs themselves, though? Because is that just the same mechanism that's on a smaller scale? Because I mean, when I look at some videos out there, and I'm being coy, of course, you can clearly see that it looks like this orb, this sphere, is just a non-radiating barrier. It's not necessarily like a metal sphere out there. So, is it the same concept that would be used to cause that to happen to a plane that is happening on a smaller scale, or do you think that's something different?
Well, this is where it gets interesting because, and it's a great question, because when there are certain situations, as I understand it, where these orbs are actual, we could say, physical
Mm-hmm.
mechanisms, whereas in other cases, they could in fact be comprised of what's called a Bose-Einstein condensate. And for those not familiar, it's basically a much lighter version of plasma, essentially. And if we think of this as potentially being the window between, this is where it gets controversial for some. This is where a lot of physicists have no problem discussing it in theory, but the second you talk about, experiment or practicality, they lose their crap. But this speaks to the notion that past this Planck level, there may in fact be something that is not material, but is coming through into the material and expressing itself as a Bose-Einstein condensate that from a distance would in fact look quite solid to, for example, human beings, for example, in certain situations. But under the case of, say, different radars or different forms of special detectors, may in fact be able to show that it maybe not be as solid as it looks. With that said, though, it is also of my understanding that there are in fact physical orbs too. So I don't want to sit here and say that I know the exact answer. Anyone that claims they do, in my humble opinion, probably is lying. But there are a couple different approaches that can be taken there in terms of not just the way they operate, but what you're deploying and what you would be operating from the perspective of an orb type situation. Now, the reason, for example, that we see or that I have proposed in the past on your show, Ashton, is of there being four orbs instead of three, is because it speaks to this notion of, first off, to put the physics aside for a moment, it speaks to this notion of squaring the circle that many of our ancient ancestors seem to be doing. I know Graham Hancock has spoken about that extensively, but it speaks to this notion of taking all four polarizations of the photon to then induce a gravitational effect. Now, what I mean by that is I'm essentially saying that there's a direct connection between light and gravity. And so it has been in the past observed from astrophysical scales that this is in fact the case, although has later been retracted, whether in papers published that were later pulled back for quote unquote controversial reasons and so on and so forth. Which is one of the reasons that you so kindly and graciously posted that research manuscript that I put together in an attempt to try and show that this type of science has been around for many decades. The papers have been published, but they either get retracted or very mysteriously disappeared. But it can certainly be done. Now, one final thing that I will say is that for those that may be thinking, well, is it possible to be, do you need a certain type of metal? Is it possible to, use any metal? Well, it depends the type of power densities one is trying to achieve. With that said, though, this is where it gets quite controversial, but I agree entirely with Dr. Sal Paez when he says that one does not need any type of special metamaterial to induce these effects. And to that extent, I do agree. Now, with that said, people have talked about, rearranging the nuclear isotopes in certain materials to induce what are called half integer spin states, because then you can sort of, if you spin one, say for example, piece of metal clockwise, another one counterclockwise, you can potentially nullify or create a sort of void in between those counter spinning, we could say, cones or materials that would then create a very similar effect to the Zitter-Buegang effect that would sort of break apart that local space-time. and create a sort of a void in between the two. But there are quite a few different ways, and I'm seeing some people here also asking why hasn't this been. Let me see here. Why hasn't it been done, and so on and so forth. And we'll get to that shortly. I would say that it in fact has, but I'll leave it there for now, just to let you jump in, brother.
Uh, Sorry, I was trying to get back to it. Yeah, and I think this is a good point to say that I don't think Dave or I or none of us are suicidal. We don't plan to go on any permanent vacations to Belize or anything like that. So I just want to throw that out there. I think it's just important to repeat several times. And just in case you do think that what we're talking about is real, which I think both of us do. Um, One thing I wanted to ask related to the orbs again too is one thing is like, so if they are like a Bose-Einstein condensate, which just for the people out there understanding why Bose-Einstein condensate is so important, is that this is where like we've looked at, like I think Anton Petrov's YouTube videos where he looks at some of the more advanced science that's on the cutting edge stuff that's just come out in the last few weeks even, where you can have fermions convert to bosons, and that's kind of what Bose-Einstein condensate can allow, is that you super cool certain elements like lithium 6, and it goes from being something that is taking up space, that you cannot have the same atoms take the same space up, to a boson, which is like a laser beam where you can focus it down to a single point. And I think this speaks as well
Right.
to what Dave talks about, where you have the waves making love, where you have these waves get into a coherent state. But now my problem with that is, okay, let's say that these orbs that we see are
Well,
doing that.
sorry, Ashton,
Go
brother,
ahead.
if I could jump
Yeah,
in very
correct
quickly.
me if I said
It,
something wrong,
it,
please.
well, if we think, and not even a correction, I want to make a quick addition. If we think of lasers as very advanced particle accelerators, basically making a particle essentially accelerate slash run, I'm trying to simplify as best I can from the moment
Mm-hmm.
one turns the laser on to the point in which the beam ends or stops at or hits a certain surface or whatnot. If we think of electricity moving across, like a little electrons moving across an elastic band, for example. Let's actually hold on. Let's imagine, Ashton, you and I stood in a room and there was carpet on the floor and we attached a big elastic band around each other and we started scraping our feet on the floor, and then we touched the doorknob and we started getting a shock, for example. A very advanced version of that would be a very strong laser pulse. Now, the reason I bring this up is because if the photons that are being emitted from that laser, the light particles, as well as the electrons, if we throw an electron beam in there, but let's stick with just the photons for now. If we can get those photons right after they're pulsed, or even before they're pulsed out, to lock in with the resonant frequency of, in this particular case, the plane, one would be able to utilize lasers to encompass essentially the entire plane. And it sounds so, what I'm about to say here sounds so far out there that many people may even laugh at it. But if it technically in principle would is possible for a laser beam using what is called a phase conjugate pump pulse width modulator to essentially lift up something as large as, for example, a submarine. And the reason I say that is because there's a difference between the mass of an object and the weight of an object. So if we think of mass being the internal resonance of every object, basically everything around us, including ourselves, is resonating within it at a particular rate, has a certain resonance within it. And some people, they've called this scalar waves. People have called this, many different names. And at that, to that extent, it doesn't really matter as long as one interprets it or understands it to the best of their ability. That's that's all that matters. But imagine every single object has within it a bunch of dancing particles. If you can get the photons emitting from your laser, for example, to dance at the exact same rate at as the object that you are trying to essentially control, you would be able to enable this not microscopic but macroscopic effect, which would be very indicative of what we've seen in the 370 footage. Although not exclusive to the 370 footage, but certainly something that in my humble opinion, I would say is quite similar to certain things that I've observed in the laboratory on much smaller scales.
Yeah, and I see Tupes hand up, which I'll let him speak in just a second then. And so is that same effect what would be allowing the orbs themselves to float freely? And then if so or if not, how can the orb both displace space-time itself, but then also have this capability to produce its own geodesic? Do you think that there must be something mechanical in there somewhere?
It speaks to the notion of we could say uh, Casimir cavities, putting two little metal plates next to each other and running a resonant frequency through it, um, and then having a whole other set of Casimir cavities on top of that one, and that would be one way that one would be able to develop or assemble an orb that could both nullify or polarize or void space-time and still induce the effects needed while remaining outside of space-time, but having that, for example, in the case of the orbs with this, certain maybe laser beams be within the vicinity of space-time, whereas the orb itself is not. And so, yes, ultimately, what I just described is conceptually the same way that you can describe what you were asking there as well. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Tupa, do you want to jump in? Sorry, I saw your hand up.
Oh yeah, I'd love to, man. This is an amazing conversation. Uh, Lasers, right? It affects like light. I'm asking, where did the if indeed a laser could be pulsed at the same rate of an object and to affect it? Are we talking about affecting the light, like making it invisible, or sending it somewhere else? If so, where else?
That brother, great to see you. By the way, it's been quite a while, and great question. I appreciate it. So, a few different things that we can look at here because those are great questions. So, there's a difference between, in the case of lasers, actually generating we could say a gravity wave, and if you can control gravity waves or you can emit gravity waves, you're essentially opening up the door to everything from stargates to it. Again, science fact begins to outstrip science fiction very, very quickly. You start to go into, for example, there was a paper I think from the late '90s that was called "Superluminal Electromagnetic Waves in Free Space." Speaking to what you were asking there, Tupac, but ultimately, the it's interesting because when you look at how photons work and how photons behave, it's possible that within photons themselves, there is in fact what you could call gravitons. And now there are different types of gravitons, we could say, but they all behave just like electricity does. Now, what I'm trying to imply there is that this is what we call a second order effect or a topological effect. So, in other words, if we had electricity and magnetism meet certain conditions, we can then turn photons or light into gravity. And where we could, for example, transport objects would not be an issue whatsoever with regards to things like distance, for example, because distance is only, we can say, one can argue strongly, an optical illusion. And if one is able to manipulate or perturb those optical illusions relative to the source that you're then emitting the photons from, space doesn't become an issue at that point. Um, you begin to bridge points in space through the shortening of time in a certain way, if that makes sense. But sorry, Tupac, I didn't mean to drift from what you were asking. Could you repeat if I didn't catch everything?
No, that was amazing. Yeah, curious. Like, uh, did the in the MH370 case, would the orbs have made the craft invisible or sent it somewhere? And I think you answered the
Oh,
question.
in my opinion, it would have likely sent it somewhere. The invisible aspect, it doesn't really, and actually, I think it's on Lockheed Martin's website. They've openly admitted to it. It the invisibility factor is something that's very, very old school. If you can bend gravity, then the light will bend around it. So light and gravity waves are very, very they hug each other basically. But if you can bend the gravitational wave or field, you can then bend the light. If you can bend the light, you can then bend the visible spectrum that we observe as humans. And as humans, we can only see photons directly. Everything else is sort of just a little bit of this, a little bit of that, et cetera, et cetera. And so, by bending or perturbing that, you would then create an invisibility factor, and then amplifying that even more, you would then be creating a sort of warp bubble situation, as I was speaking of earlier. You would begin to polarize the local space around you. With that said, though, I do think that in the case of 370, that it was sent somewhere.
So that warping polarization of the vacuum there, that's what we're talking about with the Alcubierre drive, right? I mean, we make a
Yes.
field that you separate yourself from space-time, and now, from the local frame of reference inside the field, you're going to have a different frame of reference than people who are on the outside observing you. This is what allows for, superluminal speeds to become possible, right? Where We're not actually breaking causality or anything here. We're not breaking physics. I think, as you've pointed out, we're just taking a new approach to old physics, right? And
Yep,
go ahead.
100%, to the point where I'll even give everyone an example here, just because at this point it's got, a lot of people have been talking.
Space just crashed. Hopefully it doesn't crash the space. I can't see what it says. How come I can't reconnect? Come on, man. What's going on here? It literally won't let me reconnect to the space. I can't reconnect. I can't reconnect to the space. What am I supposed to do, guys? Come on, man. Oh, there we go. We're back.
And gravity is linked with time, right? It's force over time or whatever, right? So like that's very interesting.
Very, very, very much so. Time is a bit of a difficult concept to
That was
grasp. It's
close.
I mean, it might or might not be. It depends on
Can't
how
zoom
one
out.
looks at it. The notion is that, and this speaks to a lot of what's been missing from physics to complete the unified field theory. But if one looks, for example, or envisions that all around us, we can't see it, but there are these longitudinal waves that are not even straight waves. They're more like super long slinkies that are essentially infinite in distance. And each loop or ring of the slinky represents a point where, for example, I pick up my phone and then put it back down. I go wash my hands and then turn the water off. Every time I complete a task, one of those loops on that slinky has been completed. And then, sort of like a move, like an old film reel, we move to the next frame rate or slinky, if that makes sense.
Moving through time, right? Moment by moment. Every
That would
choice.
be exactly, and that would be the description of time. And so, if one thinks, okay, if we can break that, or if we can get out of that by surpassing the speed of light barrier, you would then be able to manipulate time as well as essentially multiple spatial dimensions, which would then enable the anomalies that we now see, which would speak to the notion of, well, my phone was super blurry when I was filming the event. And then this brings up, people debating online, well, hold on, it was either just the pure pixelation or maybe an actual phenomena happened. Well, I would argue, in fact, that the phenomena caused this pixelation because the renderings of our cameras do not know how to render this higher symmetry electromagnetic phenomenon. And so therefore it's only going to show the flat intersection of these concave events. But these concave events are fueled by these slinkies, essentially.
And when you say concave, you mean like bending into the fourth dimension or something, right? Bending outside of time.
Exactly, which speaks to spin, which speaks to the notion of, again, squaring the circle. It speaks to this concept of, what our ancient ancestors drew on the cave walls of, spirals over and over and over again. I'm pretty sure that that some of them figured it out and tried to leave some messages.
Yeah, can I ask another one question here then, real quick? Is this, Dave? Would you consider this to be a wormhole in your opinion, or is that too crude an approximation of what we're talking about?
No, I would, in a certain instance, if one has enabled a situation where you're not just making an object disappear into an not set of into nothing, basically, then that's a little bit different because then you get into some temporal issues there. But if you had a situation where you specifically knew where you wanted to put an object from one place to another, then it would be a traversable wormhole, very much like the Einstein ER equals EPR. Yeah.
Yeah, and just for people who want to know what we're talking about with ER equals EPR, and I'm going to
Oh,
forget what it
sure.
is.
That's the Einstein.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's the Einstein-Rosenberg bridge. So if we actually, let me give a very basic example. So this would speak to going faster than the speed of light. But let's just put it this way: imagine on the surface of say of a road or a street, where one exists and is walking down the street, things are going normal, etc., etc. However, there is a subway underneath right where you are walking, and that subway just so happens to go much, much faster than the people above ground. And so, if this subway goes faster than the people above ground to the point where it goes so fast that not even a second goes by and that subway is already at its next location, that would be an example of how essentially one would be using wormholes to essentially bypass not just space and time, but surpass the speed of light in various aspects. Which, by the way, for those that may be interested, it was shown out of Los Alamos that Hochberg and Visser showed that it is in fact very feasible to do.
Yeah, and then when we're talking about EPR, then we're talking about quantum mechanics, right? So that just includes has Einstein, Rosen, and then is it Poldov?
Oh, yes.
Not,
Sorry, I forgot his
butcher
name, but
pronunciation.
yeah, ER, yeah,
I
EPR.
feel bad
Sorry about that, but
not getting it right. Hold on, EPR.
yeah.
But yeah, from that perspective, what we're doing here is we're talking about combining general relativity, which is the large world, macro
Yeah.
scaled world, and quantum mechanics, which is Podolsky. And the thing about that then is that people like Susskind and Maldacena have I spelled his name wrong in my space here, but no, they've pretty much argued that these concepts are related, so that the idea of quantum entanglement and quantum computers is similar to the concept of a wormhole. And if we look and
Yes.
go back
Yeah.
to the double slit experiment, we can see that information is passing faster than the speed of light. And we know this because when we're shooting something through one of two gaps, we get a wave pattern. But when we try to detect it and look at it, it changes, it reacts, something that we would not expect from science and physics. So this would mean that something here is being moved faster than the speed of light. This is what brings up non-locality. And that's the same concept as from general relativity of a wormhole. Something's able to move faster than the apparent speed of light.
And if I can add very quickly to your point, Ashton, if one took a fishbowl, for example, or even just a glass of water, and they shot a laser beam through that glass of water, essentially, what you'll find is through the kinetic emission reabsorption of the photons going through the glass, through the water, and all of that, you have essentially slowed the speed of that particular laser beam down. Now, let's think for a moment that we know if one puts a human being inside of a body of water where the water is the precisely to a T the exact same temperature as that particular person at that exact point in time, that person, other than having issues breathing, would not know that they're in water. And so if we think of that concept and we compare it to what we know as, or what we people have called the quantum vacuum, or the ether, or whatever you would like to call it, it makes one think, okay, hold on a second. On a much more, if we think about those who have done psychedelics, fractal zooming in and out and all of that, if we think about for a second the fact that, and I say this in a very crude manner, I'm not trying to say that this is my belief, but in terms of a scientific thought experiment, if there was a big laser beam that was being shot through, say, an environment that we would be in, that laser beam would be determined by us to be the speed of light. And so, this notion that, for example, people have said in the past it's not possible to break the speed of light barrier, there is in fact there is a shortcut, there is a way to get there, which is why I also think that that speaks to the what we see with regards to this sort of contradictory statements by disclosure figures, and I'll kind of just leave it at that. I think that's representative of infighting behind the scenes. Some people say this stuff can come out, others say not so much. So but yeah, if we think of that concept of the laser beam shooting through a glass of water, we see some very interesting similarities, and it may in fact be more literal and in our faces than we may think in that sense. And now if we think for a moment that if we combine that experiment with again, if we bring this full circle, a Bose-Einstein condensate, it's possible that if we deployed that Bose-Einstein condensate in that glass of water with that laser beam shooting through it, it may in fact be possible to notice that the laser beam may not act as laser-like as we're used to, meaning that the Bose-Einstein condensate may in fact create a situation where at a very small level, just within the containment of that glass, there is sort of a doorway that has opened in a way that normally would not have been possible. The same way, for example, that um, when you're inside of a pool, it's much more difficult to get to the, for example, get to the bottom or the deep end of a swimming pool and stay there because of how much pressure there is. But if there's a way to break that pressure and sort of create a void inside that pressure, then you'd be sort of creating a shortcut around a lot of what mainstream physics has said is not possible.
Yeah, and so what we're talking about here is not Star Trek teleportation, but we're talking about Star Trek warp drive, right? Or even Star Wars with the Imperial battle cruisers that go to their super speed out there. And the thing that I found is interesting after I read your research analysis that you did that I posted was that it was a lot simpler than I thought. Initially, I thought this
Yes.
was going to be very complicated, but it really just goes back to the Alcubierre drive, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. And then to bring it back full circle with UFOlogy, I've said this a lot, but if there are UAPs that are visiting us that are showing these properties that we see, I mean, they're not going sub light speeds. They have to be going very fast speeds in order to get dozens, if not hundreds, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of light years away from us to us. We need something that goes faster than the speed of light. To quote Stephen Greer, the speed of light is too slow.
That's a very good point. So when we think of this notion that, for example, we so there's a phrase that's not really well known, which is that charge parity inversion is equivalent to reflection. Now, what I mean by that is if we take, for example, two particles and we electrically charge them in a Bose-Einstein condensate, and we met a couple of other conditions electromagnetically, we'd be able to find that these particles will in fact appear, then disappear, then reappear, then disappear, almost as if the ether or the quantum vacuum all around us is behaving like one big oscillating mirror. And so when we think of something like that and we think of what we call the ether or the quantum vacuum as a set of mirrors, for example, the question becomes, can we resonate those charged particles? And so if we can resonate those charged particles, whether we see them or not is not the point. But if we can resonate them to a certain degree, it may be possible that those particles will be entirely viewable, observable, but enable an effect or a phenomenon that is at this point I would say indiscernible from magic, but at the same time something that would be um, I think would a lot of mainstream physicists at least would have a very hard time accepting. The same way that it took like 30 or 40 years to accept the Aronoff-Bohm effect, which is a very basic, repeatable experiment that shows there's a phase shift, which implies that something is occurring in the ether or the quantum vacuum, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this is actually, Ashton, I want to thank you for doing this because I think that if we relied on mainstream science, we would not get there ever. So.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to ask then is, what would it take? What kind of power levels? What kind of requirements would it take to, break the fabric of space time? One thing that I've been hypothesizing recently is that we've been talking about Grenier, and he's been talking about fractal toroids, which is donut within a donut within a donut. He mentioned, I think, on the space the YouTube that we were on the stream with alien scientists, that it would take at least three fractals, like deeper and deeper and deeper of the donuts, in order to achieve a shape that will essentially cause like a focusing of any type of, like, let's say a particle accelerator or electrons or anything that you would shoot into it. What is your thoughts
Right.
on that, or what the requirements would be?
Sure. Well, I can say one thing, which is that, and again, I will give as many practical examples as I can, and I will be honest in saying that this is not something that if I those in the audience listening, whether now or later, can go and replicate, but certainly helps with regards to more of a practical correlation. So, a lot of people have claimed to see craft exhibit extremely bright colors before they immediately take off in a very surreal type of way. And so, I'm going to bring this full circle to your question, Ashton. And one of the things that I would like to give a hint on for anyone that's willing to look into this is that if you look at how ultraviolet pulses from lasers work, how they look, etc., etc., it's very possible that what we're seeing when the craft take off are the exact same colors within the ultraviolet spectrum, which indicate that there is a UV pulse occurring that has now been scaled up and amplified to the extent that it is able to encompass and therefore transport an entire craft. Whether it's through extremely fast speeds or going at the speed of light or even superluminal FTL, faster than light travel. With that said, I know there was a gentleman that had I think he was a Marine, and he claimed to see in 2000, I think 8 or 9, a craft in Indonesia. He testified quite some time ago, I think at the Stephen Greer press club conference earlier this year, as well as he was on I forgot that, I think Sean Ryan was his name, 2 or 3 weeks back. Anyways, point being is that what he claimed to see in terms of the colors, the way that this black craft took off and all of that, what he's describing is identical to an ultraviolet pulse in the lab. And if we think of these fractal toroids, as you mentioned, Ashton, we then wonder, okay, fractals, and fractals speaks to the notion of, big, small, zoom in, zoom out, et cetera, et cetera. If one can somehow amplify that ultraviolet pulse from a very small level to a very large level using, for example, room temperature superconductivity, or using a certain type of resonant frequency that would encompass the entire craft, one would in fact possibly be able to create those, as what we call here in the name of this space tonight, macroscopic effects. So not just super small effects at the quantum level, but bring that quantum effect to full-on observable reality, and essentially enable these effects using a laser beam pulse,
Yeah.
particularly a UV, an ultraviolet pulse
So
in particular.
why do we need room temperature superconductivity to achieve this? Something I've always kind of wondered. Maybe I think the people in the chat would
No,
want to know too.
we don't. To be honest with you, we actually don't. It could be done with high temperature superconductors too, and low
Okay.
temp ones. You don't. There's more than one way to skin this cat. Yeah,
But why is
you can,
superconductivity important in general?
because there's zero resistivity to the electrons within the bulk material itself. And so what happens in that particular case is it just enables okay, let's put it this way. And I wasn't planning on saying this tonight, but I figured I might as well. There's a few different. One approach is an electromechanical approach, which involves what we were discussing earlier with the aluminum cylinder spinning and whatnot. Another approach is a solid state approach, which is no moving parts. In that particular case, you would then have perhaps certain instances where you would have certain superconductors in certain arrangements that would then be pulsed with a UV laser or with some other apparatuses that would emit, in this particular case, gravitons themselves. So there's a few different, and this is one way that this has been able to be hidden in plain sight with regards to how these contractors develop the tech. It's possible to have the tech developed at these fabrication and wafer factories all around the world, and then what would happen is you then have it shipped back to you, and you assemble the final product in house. But um, the power densities, the materials, the chemistry, all of that is all there in order to enable these effects. And I say this in a very unfortunate sense, but regretfully, but the way the system has been set up, whoever devised it, or whatever set of individuals over time developed it, in terms of being able to keep this stuff right under our noses while still having manufacturers develop the necessary materials to enable the effects when Lockheed assembles it back in their, home base, it's been completely manipulative and terrible for humanity, but I extremely smart.
I love how you just
So
threw Lockheed Martin out there. We're just calling him out by name now.
yeah, at this
Uh,
point, I mean, at this point, come on, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, who else is honestly doing it? There's only a handful of people possible. I really like the idea that you just threw out there, though, is that each of these components can be built in different locations, right? And then you pull it all together. This is one of the requirements in order to keep stuff secret. It's compartmentalization, right? So people
right,
know they're working on advanced microchips. Maybe they're working at a company called, I don't know, Freescale Semiconductors or something like that, right? And then they
right.
send their piece over to, ship it to America. Maybe, let's say, a high temperature superconductive microchip, something like that. Maybe that's an essential
And
component.
sure, and let's actually scale it back to everyone here that's listening, because a lot of people here, I believe, the people that I see here that I do know or know of, are very good and very avid researchers, and I encourage you guys to keep going. To give a practical and prime example, is that there are pieces of information on the internet that, when are scattered and are not connected in a certain way, are considered harmless and not a threat to national security, et cetera, et cetera. But when compile, if certain information from all across the internet is then assembled in a particular way, it then becomes classified. And so it's something that in fact certain people have in fact stumbled upon, and the information is out there for tapping this stuff. It's just a matter of how one puts the pieces together and has to separate the wheat from the chaff, essentially. And that's one of the biggest problems, as well as understanding what one is attempting to develop or emit. Because again, as I said, with starting this space here, we must realize the difference between inertial mass reduction, so getting a craft to slowly lift off and lose its internal weight, essentially, a full-on graviton pulse, and then the polarizing of the vacuum to make the warp bubble. These are three separate things, but they're all very vital in conjunction with the phenomenon that we see.
Okay, yeah, great. So the inertial mass reduction, this is something I've been confused about, that I want to just touch on real quick, is what allows something to become weightless, right? Is what we're talking about. But it's also been used in terms like where you're like protecting the occupants of a craft that's moving at superluminal speeds from being liquefied as well. Can you just um, kind of separate those two concepts for us, or are they based on the same idea?
Sure. Well, I mean, it depends on what one is trying to achieve. But at the end of the day, for example, the inertial mass reduction would be able to create a situation where you can encompass with a dielectric material your, you could say, cockpit of your crew and your craft that would then be unaffected by the outer skin of the craft, which would then be in a certain going at superluminal speeds, for example. And so the this speaks again to the polarization, not of the vacuum, but in this case, the polarization between the occupants inside the craft and then the actual outer layer of the craft and the physical environment outside of that craft. And so you are separating, you are polarizing your state of, for lack of a better term, existence. In other words, this is space-time metric engineering. For anyone that may be thinking, if is this, Puthoff space-time metric engineering? It basically is. But you would be polarizing your cockpit or your crew from the rest of the craft itself by having an internal dielectric shell, or a dielectric encasement, um, that would be enclosing you and your crew, essentially.
Okay. One last thing, and then we can take some questions as well that I wanted to address is when I was watching some scientific presentations by Susskind and Maldacena about ER equals EPR, one thing that I think they both mentioned, actually two different aspects. One that we've already touched on, which is that if you want an object to be able to go through a wormhole, its mass basically has to become zero, because if you try to put some mass through this wormhole, it's a very delicate situation that's created, then it's going to cause the wormhole to potentially collapse, or if other stuff falls into it, it potentially collapse. Think of like if you have a big butt and you can't get through a doorway kind of situation. Um,
Right.
the other thing, though, is that they talked about needing negative energy in order to sustain the wormhole. And one thing I found that was
Yes.
interesting about this concept, which I want to get your thoughts on, are what we see in the MH370 videos, an endothermic event. We see an absorption of energy, which is really the opposite of a release of energy. And I wondered about what's the relationship there between this absorption of energy, this endothermic event, and potentially the need for negative energy. Could it be that the negative energy that we need is being absorbed there, or is this just a matter of when you break through to, let's call it the matrix, the underlying framework behind space-time, that the endothermic event is just kind of it collapsing on itself? What is your view on that?
Sure, the endothermic event is a result of the induction of this negative energy. What we've been discussing this entire time is actually inducing this negative energy in various ways. Other than the actual genuine emission of gravitons, putting that aside, the inertial mass reduction and the polarization of the vacuum and the alkubarometric warp drive and the warp bubble, that would all be negative mass, negative energy, whatever we'd like to call it, essentially. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go ahead and do you have anything else you want to say before we take some questions here?
No, no, it's actually, I think we're approaching an hour, and unfortunately, within the next 20, 30 minutes at most, I myself have to take off. So I think it's good if we jump to questions. And I appreciate you so much, brother, for doing this, because I wanted to just do my best to lay out to the community, for those that were gracious enough to listen, the difference to my understanding of what these different effects are, and and yeah, hopefully some people can read between the lines here with respect to my not just saying that this is theoretical. It has been done experimentally, and I know I don't expect anyone to blindly believe me, because unless someone has seen it in the lab themselves, I don't blame anyone at all. But yeah.
Okay, so just we're gonna do questions. I'm gonna give some quick rules for the questions here. I don't want to hear anyone's life stories. I know everybody's got experiences. That's great. We have a limited amount of time, so please keep your question high and tight, and we will try to address as many as we can. If you want to speak, feel free to request to speak and put your hand up, and I'm just going to go in order of who I can see. If you don't have hand raising capability, wave at me, and I'll take a look. So let's start with Tupacabra.
Thank you again for your time, guys. Quick and easy questions. Dave, does the MH370 video, as presented to us, what we can see, do the shape and behavior of the craft and the whole event itself align with your research into this kind of like future tech?
To the point where it's goosebumps. Like, I get goosebumps. I've yes, to the point where yes, on smaller scales, experimentally, yes. This is what one of the things that I was trying to try and explain using the research manuscript that Ashton graciously published for me to try and get more attention, because I wanted to lay a theoretical groundwork with that particular compilation of papers to show that people like Eric Davis have done papers on it showing it's possible 20-25 years ago. It then later got retracted. Some of the papers that were published in that package that I and Ashton put out there are screenshots of papers that are not necessarily classified, but they're not public either. And the way that I got a hold of them is a different situation. But the point being is that I'm very frustrated with the fact that it looks like there's an attempt to put all this back in the box. And although some people may think that this stuff is not possible, in my opinion, it is.
Thank you. And one last question. I know that we've been talking for over a year about this stuff, and you seem to be on the tip of the spear, even to the point where it's dangerous to talk about it at times, right? What is the likelihood, in your opinion, that a special effects artist from 2014 was able to produce this video to such a realistic degree to your current research now in 2023? What is the likelihood?
I'm just gonna. I appreciate the question, brother. I'm just gonna give everyone here my honest opinion. Anything is possible, but in this particular case, I don't mean to be so declarative, but I would go as far as to say I know for a fact that the effects we've seen in the MH370 videos are precisely indicative of what's called a quadrupole mass oscillation moment, which creates and induces this negative mass, this negative energy, facilitates the effects, or at least facilitates the possibility of these effects to occur. So, anything's always possible, and I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I would bet huge money that that event was real.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that. Dr. One of One, you're up.
Alrighty, thanks. So I'm a full stack quantum engineer, and it's
Nice.
ironic. It's ironic that we're talking about advanced quantum science, yet we're discussing black holes, wormholes, portals at our own detriment. So, word to the wise, think about how this technology could be useful as opposed to it ending humanity.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I very I appreciate that, brother. Very well said. Very well said. I couldn't agree more. I really couldn't. This creates a what we could call a dual use situation, right? Which you may know better than myself. It's the same thing where you pick up a hammer, right? You could fix a bench with it, or you can hit someone on the back of the head with it. It comes down to that.
So my question is quantum computers solving all our problems, where is the good outcome?
That's an interesting. I'm of the humble view that I think that we need to evolve in the, dare I say, spiritual sense more than relying on quantum computers to solve everything for us. And I say that just because it is of my experience that and understanding that quite a few of the so-called problems we face today were solved quite some time ago. Whether it's through the understanding of this type of technology and physics, or through other things in conjunction with this. And so I'm not necessarily saying that the path we're taking as saying, quantum AI computers and all of that will fix everything for us is bad. But I think that we need to really revisit the core basics of physics, science, and realize that, or try our best to investigate the possibility that the knowledge that may enable these effects to practically occur may be so right in front of us that we've actually forgotten that it even exists, to the point where it's like, it's like, you're kidding me. You're in the lab and you look and you go, my God, that's what we've been missing. And it's like, Jesus, like, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, if
So
I
I'm yeah, yeah.
I just want to jump in as well because I totally agree. What Dr. 101 just said is really important. To me, this is actually what I bring up to everybody who I've met who is a prominent UFO disclosure advocate is, would you still be for UAP disclosure, UFO disclosure, let's just call it what it is, if the reality of the technology meant the end of the world? Because we have good effects that we can get, free energy, fusion power. We can have the ability to change how transportation works, right? We can change the circumstances of millions, if not billions, of people on the planet. I say this all the time. This is what my
Right.
motivation is for revealing the technology. And even when we talked to Dr. Stephen Greer, I asked him this question. Same question Dr. One of One just answered is, can this technology destroy civilization? And he said, yes, that needs to be hidden. But going to the
Well,
conversation and argument,
the the,
real quick, let me finish
the
this up
reason.
and then you can jump in.
Okay.
So then the argument and conversation Kim.com had with him is, well, why don't they just give us the cure to cancer? Because it's not like that. It's like unleashing Pandora's box. Once you've unleashed the technology, you get everything. You want nuclear power, you get nuclear bombs, right? We're talking about this technology can absolutely create doomsday weapons, potentially doomsday weapons that a single person could destroy the whole planet. Go ahead, Dr. 101. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, so it's actually against our odds that we even exist. So Neil deGrasse Tyson said that if the sun was any size larger, its gravitational pull would like throw our whole solar system out of whack. If it was smaller, we'd be moving faster. Um, so this is not normal that our
Yeah.
solar system is the way it is, and there's not other solar systems like this. So a shooting star is a phenomenon, like a supernova is a phenomenon, and the life expectancy of a star, you know millions of years old or something like that, where the life expectancy of a human is 100 years old, or less than that. So it's absolutely ridiculous that we're even having this conversation, because you know people die in their youth.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yes.
probability
Go ahead.
distribution is very low compared to, yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, 100%. One more thing I'd like to add before we jump to someone else is that this is something that I'll probably bring up in more detail in the future. But there's someone that I met along the way within the Department of Defense that had developed a handful of years ago a um, graviton or gravity wave detector, which was essentially something that could see through all physical objects. So it would do tremendous benefit to combating human trafficking, drug trafficking, etc., etc. And I encourage people to make of this as they will. Not asking anyone to blindly believe me, but this, I'm certain and sure this is not the first time this happened. But this was the one instance that I know of where a very, very intelligent, very high level individual within a very discrete branch of the DoD developed a graviton detector to combat human trafficking, et cetera, and essentially was not allowed to have it deployed for political reasons. Again, I know that may be a controversial statement, but there have been attempts in the past. The same way that, for example, certain individuals get funded by the Air Force or the Navy in North America, and they get given a couple million for their project, and then you never hear anything after that. And then you find out later that that project got scuttled off to DARPA or something like that. Well, if the project didn't work or the experiment was not successful as was publicly claimed, why is it going to DARPA? Why is it receiving more funding, et cetera, et cetera? This has happened time and time again. And I saw someone here ask, is it possible to replicate the theory in the lab? If yes, why hasn't it been done yet? This was one of the examples, although I am unfortunately highly limited to the examples I can give, at least for now, the Saxel and Woodward example of the rotating aluminum cylinder that was electrically charged that would then lose its weight. That's one example of a basic but a proof of concept or proof of principle situation that was recorded, was logged, was repeated, and was just quietly dismissed, sort of like what Jacques Vallée had said quite some time ago when he said people write some very interesting papers on some very interesting phenomena they can produce in the lab. They claim to get results, and then you never hear from it again or from them again.
Yeah. And I would jump in and say as well that, perhaps the answer to the great filter and Fermi paradox is the exact technology we're talking about. Perhaps any sufficiently advanced civilization uncovers this secrets of the universe and ends up destroying themselves. I think that's something we have to be very cognizant of. Let's jump to
Yep.
some other questions here. We're gonna go to Max next, and then I think I'm not sure if JK Philly fan or Star Captain want to talk. They don't have their hands up, but we'll ask them right after we go with Max here. Go ahead. And if anyone else just wants to speak up, please request, and either I or Red Panda can help pull you up.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say first, Ashton and Red and Dave and Sam, a lot of people in the room, but particularly you gentlemen, just greatest of respect for everything you do, everything you put up with, and all of your hard work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
But no, thank you, honestly. But Dave, if there is a time at a later date we could possibly speak privately, there's a lot I'd like to share with you. Not,
Sure.
I don't want to waste time, as Ashton said, talking about personal experiences. But there are questions I've been wanting to ask someone such as yourself for 10 years, and it relates exactly to these orbs, these spheres of light, whether physical or coming through in some kind of non-physical way.
Right.
If I can put it right. The flashes of light that I know that you've mentioned previously, because I was getting goosebumps when I've listened to you talk before, because of what I've experienced. And so these flashes of light, would they be ultraviolet kind of Doppler effect visible to the naked eye? That say if a sphere was to shoot
Yes.
off at a high rate of speed, yeah?
Yeah.
Secondly, the trace lines, visible trace lines, like a ghosting effect when they shoot off. I think you mentioned that on the same talk you gave on, I forget
That
who it.
Yeah, that if I could say very quickly, that would
Mhm.
depend on the material of the craft itself. Some people
Right.
have claimed to see things like, for example, what's been coined angel hair, falling off of sort of a white mist sort of material falling off of the craft after it's zoomed off.
Hmm. Right.
And
Okay.
so, yeah,
Oh, I see. So it could be possibly one version, not another.
right.
To
I'll go
explain that.
even as far. Sorry to interrupt you, Max. I'll
That's
go even
right.
as far as to tell everybody here that there have been cases. I've seen certain documents that have. Let's just say there have been cases where craft that have taken off in a forest when they're closer to the ground, for example, after they've taken off, the plants that were near the craft during the takeoff were then studied by DoD, etc. And the plants aged 2 years within less than 10 seconds, which speaks to the notion that whatever the craft was doing, it was harnessing a form of particle acceleration that was able to break the speed of light barrier and therefore manipulate the temporal elements of the plants around it. I
You,
think it was not intentional. I think it just had to do with the takeoff of that particular craft. But
you
those cases have been recorded over and over again.
exactly. You've just literally answered one of my other questions. So, time dilation in proximity to one of these objects. If
Yeah,
you are a local observer, let's say, and you've just answered the question, but let's say you're within 80 feet of a plasma engulfed object,
right.
um, and you do not have any breaks in your linear timeline of exactly what happened, appears to last, let's say, 6 or 7 minutes to the observer that's close. but in actuality, outside of that bubble, let's say, of proximity, let's say 45 minutes have passed. So that would make
Yes.
perfect sense. Right. Excellent. And then,
And this is also why people see quite often, and this is where I would say this is our tech. When I our meaning humans, people see craft take off, but they quite often they see a huge mist or plasma emitted around the craft before it takes off. That's entirely because the craft cannot tap that 0 point field or cannot void the local reality or space-time metric around us by simply penetrating solids. It needs to penetrate that Bose-Einstein condensate that surrounds it first, because it acts as the doorway to essentially get out of quote unquote here.
could I ask, David, silence? Let's say many people report this, of course. Um, how could you explain an absolute vacuum silence in proximity to an object like this? And if you don't mind, if I can bang out a couple of questions, then I can finish. The coloration of the orbs, if people are seeing red, let's say over power lines, high tension power lines, obviously the coloration is the energy, and we pick up as a color spectrum, but red, amber, white. Would there be a temperature drop and static charge in the air, extreme static charge? Could all of these things be explained by the physics of this? And finally, I think you answered earlier about the electromagnetism being coupled with light, at least visible light to the human eye. This would
Right.
explain, would this explain, for example, plasma shards of light emanating from an object which seem to be retracting and extending, as if, I know this is a silly way of putting it, but somebody once put it to me this way, as a lightsaber in the movie from Star Wars or something. So if shards of light were retracting and extending and slow motion waves around a plasma engulfed object, would that make sense given the physics that you
You,
understand?
Yes, you just described everything that can be done with lasers, extremely high voltage capacitors, and a couple of other things. So if I can try and answer that all in one shot, this notion of coronal discharge, this notion of, people have allegedly claimed they've seen craft, like to go near lightning, because it seems like there's something that the lightning has that the craft may in fact be uh, pulled towards for power purposes or for other reasons. If we think of the planet as one large capacitor, and if we think of a Van de Graaff generator, those things that when you touch the metal ball head, your hair goes up. If we think of that basic electrostatic concept, and we think of when you pulse a Van de Graaff generator with a smaller metal ball, you see those very large spark discharges. If we think of what we call lightning and coronal discharge in the sky, etc., as extremely large electrostatic pulses, it then really simplifies our understanding, because then we say, okay, what needs to be done in combination with sound, light, electromagnetism, and certain resonant frequencies that can, in fact, induce these effects. So, in other words, Max, I would say that everything you're saying, I would very strongly agree with. And yes, the physics behind it, the physics analysis, and all of that is all covered in a unified approach that covers all of what you said there. Yes, yeah. For anyone
Thank
that is
you.
interested, I would encourage people to look into the work of Dr. Myron Evans. He recently passed away, but Myron, Myron Evans, which he dealt in, most of his work, I believe, was largely classified, but he dealt in higher symmetry electromagnetics. And very quickly, to make a quick physical and metaphysical connection, if we think of the same way that a male and a female, when intimate, they birth a child, if we think of electricity and magnetism, electricity being the divine masculine and magnetism being the divine feminine, if we think of using electromagnetism to, in a certain way, phase conjugate or make love, it could be possible that the birth child of that effect would be a gravity wave. So, yes, yeah.
So I
Thank
think we're
you.
gonna go on to somebody else here as well, just because we don't have a lot of time. Max, I appreciate your questions there. You can probably reach out to Dave if you have others that you want to get to. Otherwise, maybe the next space can jump on and ask some more. I want to
Please
get
do, yeah.
to a few others. So, JK Philly fan, if you had a question, I'm not sure if you can raise your hand. Go ahead.
And it's my pleasure, Ashton and Dave. The question is, you mentioned electrostatic field, and my question is, does the water vapor in this organizing this electrostatic field at a dielectric constant to create, in essence, this warp bubble that you're mentioning. So is water vapor a key component to this? That's all.
Water, yes, as well as certain you can, and this is why I say there's more than one way to skin this cat. So water is one of them. Hydrogen is another one. Um, there's a few different, yeah. There's a few, that's why I'm saying when I say Bose-Einstein condensate, I'm hinting towards what you're asking there. I just have to watch my words a little bit. But yes, yes.
Any follow up,
Thank you.
JK? Go ahead.
That's it. Thank you for my. I would give the floor to someone else. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for being here, man. Appreciate you. Star Captain,
Yeah.
do you have anything you wanted to say?
Hi, how's it going there, Ashton
Yeah,
and
how's it
everybody?
going?
Doing all right. So interesting thoughts on this topic and the technology. So I think that knowing about the time space warp tech is one thing, but applying its use ethically, which is what we were talking about, is really the bigger question. Society needs to debate if we want this technology to be made available for the public. Now that we're aware of it, so we kind of need to consider like the and debate the ethical, legal, and societal implications, and discover by that process of debate how we are going to govern over that technology should it be made public. Because obviously there is the dual sword, good and bad uses for this, and that needs to be considered. And I think by openly debating that process and like, how would we roll out teleportation technology and have that be secure, right? How do we ensure that there's privacy and security that are taken into account, right? How do we prohibit the development or use of warp weapons and things of that nature? Because those technologies would ultimately have to be discussed and legally looked at and ethically looked at before our ability to actually roll out anything of that nature, right? So I think that's part of the bigger discussion society needs to have if we want to really advance, um, bringing that disclosure forth. Because if we theoretically come up with ideas of how to govern that technology and then kind of shovel that to the government being like, hey, come on, we can handle this shit now, like we're writing the laws for you, kind of get something done. They might look at it a little bit differently than being like, well, we're going to roll out teleportation technology. Well, the public is writing the laws for you and giving it to you, so yeah, roll it out.
If I can actually add to what to your question or to your statement there, Star Captain, it's a very great point. I would dare to say that this is exactly what's being discussed behind the scenes right now. And one of the reasons that I'm for far more transparency on this than otherwise is because what if what if there's maybe not en masse, but what if to say a fair extent over the last 5, 6 decades in especially, what if this technology was tested on people unknowingly? And the fact that it was hidden for so long creates an issue where you then have a situation where I'm not saying this will be the case, but for example, people, particularly people in Europe and North America, are going to demand insurance payouts from their government because how many fighter pilots, good people, actually saw something and all of a sudden now they lost their pension, they lost their family just for reporting what they saw. How many people were, dare I say, and this is where it gets into a very touchy area with things like psychotronics and whatnot, but how many people were perhaps behaviorally affected because of a psychotronic event that was then never later reported, and because it never officially existed? And so how do you deal with that? And I'm not claiming to have the answer. All I know is that if we hide this stuff even more, it's just going to get worse. You're going to have people debating about whether an event actually occurred or not, when in reality, you have some group that's not even officially legally sanctioned using psychotronics on. Anyways, you know where I'm going with this, but I'm sorry that I can't answer in more detail. I would say that this is one of the dilemmas that is occurring right now, and I'm not saying that we should leave it up to the people behind the scenes to even decide it for us, which is one of the reasons that I want to engage with the community more through things like this, because it's a very touchy subject. Because to someone that asked a little while ago, well, what if you just release the cancer curing stuff, for example? Well, what if the core conceptual framework of the physics of the cancer curing is something that within an afternoon could be adjusted to become an extremely lethal psychotronic direct energy weapon? This becomes the problem.
Yeah, and I'd say what we're talking about here is the legal implications. I'd actually like to do some podcasts or maybe even some spaces where we just dig into just that in general, because you can imagine, guys, there's a lot of legal implications. Let's try to get to a few more questions. I think we're probably going to just be able to address a few more that we've got on here. Mitogen, what did you want to say?
Hey guys, great space. Thank you, Ashton, and thank you, Dave, for everything. It's great information. I'm just gonna make a statement. For everyone in here, if you want this technology to be able to help the Earth, we have to advance spiritually. We have to stop obfuscating and being cagey around everyone and stop the violence. Part of the reason why this technology is being held in secret is because there's a lot of global tensions and wanting to keep this as a weapon, as leverage for whoever is holding it is corrupting, and the spirit is corrupting the human psyche. Like we can't keep like technology that could potentially change the world as something that should be hidden just because we have tensions between each other. So if you're wondering what you can do to advance in terms of getting this out, I would encourage everyone to just love each other even more, and I promise that this will reverberate across the entire earth, and that way we can remove like the stigma around this subject. It's a lot of power, this technology. It's enormous power, and I think that the first step to be able to wield it is to remove the sort of violence that we're sort of experiencing here on earth.
Yeah, thanks, Mitogen. Totally agree with you, man. Let's do a couple
Yep.
other questions because we don't have a ton of time left. William, I think you were up next.
Hello. I think we cannot keep hiding this because it's based on a little trick. And as soon as you know the trick, you see it everywhere. And because you can see it everywhere means that you'll know whether you're being attacked by it or not. So I just have a really simple question because I'm out and about. Can you answer me about what the difference between gravity and magnetism is?
Sure. You could say that they're related. You could say that gravity is magnetism's cousin. You could argue that if one manipulated the A field, which is the magnetic vector potential, on the theoretical side via the del cross operator, as Richard Feynman proved, you'd be able to induce um, what have been called gravito or gravito magnetic effects. Um, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that they're not connected. They are. There's gravity waves are proportion when they're emitted. Their power, intensity, and density depend on the square root of the static B field that is perhaps controlling that gravitational emission. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend like they're not connected. They are directly.
So I
Hopefully
have a
that
better way
answers
to
you.
explain this. It's a little bit better if you don't mind.
Can
If I
I
can give
just say it real quick like it is? Gravity's magnetism. It's the same thing. And magnetism is what electricity does when you squeeze.
Okay, so from my understanding of gravity and electromagnetism, electromagnetism has it's a spectrum. So light is on the electromagnetic spectrum. Gravity is a quantum scale electromagnetism that stacks upon itself. The electromagnetism we're used to seeing is light and magnets and stuff like that, and electromagnets. But because it's on a quantum scale and it stacks and accumulates upon itself, we can't really measure it the same way, but it does have the effect of gravity.
I would say to both William and to Crow, I would say that Um, I both agree with you. I agree with both of you. Magnetism cancels out gravity. Now, there's a difference between, this is why I was trying to discern the difference earlier, a difference between the cancellation or the nullification of gravity within the vicinity of a magnetic fluctuation or a magnetic event compared to the actual genuine emission of gravitons or gravity waves. But with that said, I do very strongly agree that magnetism is directly correlated. It's not a coincidence that craft have been UAP, UFO have been seen all over the planet, very close to very strange geomagnetic anomalies. I will not sit here and pretend like that's not the case. You look, for example, at even
Well, you know how
Boyd
prime
Bushman.
numbers work? Gravity is
Sorry.
like the prime number, and electromagnetism and regular magnetism are like higher forms of that. But it's like when you stack enough gravity on top of each other, it's a whole nother thing. but gravity is its own thing in itself that's much stronger, but it has similar effects.
Cool.
Uh,
Sure.
if I'm understanding you correctly, I would agree. Yeah, the behavior of the gravitational uh, waves, fields, effects are behaviorally likened and akin and connected to that. We could possibly say through an entanglement to that of electromagnetic foundations.
Yep. So appreciate that. Dr. 101, I think we'll have you do the last question if you have a follow up.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna say a theoretical premise that is based on the scientific method of proving a hypothesis. So solid, liquid, gas, atoms. The way that the atoms are arranged in a solid is they're more closer together, and then in a liquid, the atoms are well H2O, but are looser, and then in a gas, it's much the atoms are much freely. So on the quantum level of an atom, the proton neutron is in the nucleus while the electron is on the outer edge. And then so even a atom has empty space in it. So all things are either made up of atoms or the absence of space in an atom. So the human brain, let's say the human brain is solid, but the synapses and the neurons in the brain functioning, like memory, would be, the quantum neurology of an idea of a thought. So the premise and theory is that I've neural well the brain is quantum AGI, quantum AI. The brain is quantum AI, and that I've neural linked with a quantum computer. So my brain is pretty much a quantum computer.
Yeah, I think we probably both agree with you. I think that Dave and
Yeah.
I'll let him speak for himself, but I think that we both agree that there's something with consciousness, right? That you could analogize to quantum mechanics, right? Where the brain and consciousness is a singularity, and then we are living in this macro world, which is this projection that we see perhaps put on top of. I like the Matrix analogy myself, but the idea is
I
that there's
put
some
something
underlying
in the nest
framework.
about that. Ashton, I put something in the nest about that, about quantum jumping and biophotons. You were talking about photons earlier on. Biophotons are something that the body uses, and specifically the nerve system of the body. I believe it's tied to the concept of the light body that our spirit is connected to. Is it actually our biophotonic form?
Yeah, appreciate that. Um, I'm just so I think we're gonna kind of close this down because I want to respect Dave's time, but I want to see if Dave has any last thoughts or anything he wants to share. If you want to plug anything, Dave, and then I will also do the same at the end.
Sure, I appreciate it. No, that's pretty much it. I want to thank you so much, Ashton, for doing this and for hosting this and putting this together. I want to thank everyone for showing up. I actually didn't expect as many people to show up as have, and so I really appreciate that. And for anyone that's interested, of course, I think most people know by now that we have on the side I have a Patreon in conjunction with my consulting contracting line of work. And so for anyone that's interested, I'll publish papers on there and whatnot, and it for a small amount of money every month, it keeps the trolls out, so to speak. So other than that, I mean, basically I have the Generation Z channel, and if anyone, again, not necessarily here to advertise this, but if anyone's interested in having more discussions, or even, again, I do not just DoD contracting, but even private institutions, private groups. If you head to phasehelix.com, PhaseHelix.com, then you can you can see some of my patents, some of my stuff, and then you can get a hold of me there if you would like as well. So, but other than that, I want to thank you so much, brother, for having me on, and I want to thank everyone here, truly from the bottom of my heart for coming out and listening. I didn't think it would get as much traction as it did, and so I really appreciate everybody here. And let me just be clear in saying that I'm not claiming to have the answers. I'm claiming to have a set of answers based on my research experiments and experience that hopefully I can discuss one day with respects to some of the things that I've been privy to. So other than that, thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, and I just want to say the same thing. Thank you very much, Dave Rossi. You're one of my favorite people on the planet. I think you're an extremely intelligent individual. I still find it hard to believe that you are as young as you are. It seems like I would still say that maybe you figured out how to reverse aging and you've gone back in time or something like that. But yeah, and I'm going to thank everybody who is followers and watching along. I agree. I didn't anticipate this many people, as well as a lot of people who are watching the live stream. So thank you guys for listening to the science here. I think the big takeaway would be the responsibility aspect of this, right? So let's just say, for the sake of argument, this technology is true. We have to have really serious conversations about how we utilize it without potentially destroying ourselves. These are geopolitical implications in terms of how we get this information out there to everybody. So that's what I would urge people, especially in the UFO community, to kind of have those conversations, push that conversation forward. From the conspiracy people angle who are in here, I think that what we need to get done is we need to get Congress involved in conspiracy hearings around the technology. Like, yes, I know that the UFOs and the alien stuff is very interesting, but in order to get that to come out, we have to say, here's the technology that's being hidden from us. Here are the companies that are hiding it. Lockheed Martin, I'm looking at you. And then when we get that to come out, everything else will just like a string of dominoes. It's going to all fall, right? So I also want to say that we have a pretty exciting announcement potentially coming up. I'm not going to announce it just right now yet, but Dave and I are potentially going to be together on a potential podcast in the next week or so. And once that is official, I will go ahead and announce it for everybody. But until then, stay excited, and I hope everybody has a wonderful Friday evening here. And you guys have a good one. We will talk soon. I'll see you guys in some other spaces, other live streams, etc. Thanks to you, everybody. Appreciate everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, guys, that was awesome. I think that was an awesome space. Just as I mentioned, Dave is I think one of the smartest people that I've ever interacted with. It's incredible to me that, just several weeks ago, I didn't even know who he was. And, now we're doing spaces and I'm learning about, advanced science from people who are literally working on it, and that this stuff is being kept hidden from us. In some cases, right out in the open, especially the part about this being an Alcubierre drive. It's like we've known about this concepts of Einstein-Rosen bridges for decades, So I think that a lot of this stuff is, while it's very complex, at the same time, it's all just out there, and it's not as hard as I thought to really understand. So, yeah, we've got some great stuff coming up, guys. Once I have more information to share, I will. It's one of those situations I want to make sure everything has been, locked down before we get it out there, just because the nature of the toxicity and the trolls that are out there in general. But I look forward to big things with Dave in the future and going over more of the scientific concepts, as well as, of course, the MH370 videos. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good night, and we will talk again soon. Appreciate you, everybody on the stream.